The history books talk a lot about Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal in the Depression in the 1930s. Not so well known is Theodore Roosevelt's earlier Square Deal, or years later what Harry S. Truman called the Fair Deal. But the fact is, whenever the ruling class shuffles the cards, the working class and oppressed are sure to wind up with a raw deal. You can take that to the bank. Somehow the 1% gets all the aces, and the rest of us, the 99%, get the 2s, 3s, and 4s. We study history to apply the lessons of the past to the struggles of today. The basic tenets of Marxism were paid for by the blood of working class martyrs, and we honor them by remembering the lessons that they can teach. This report will focus on some popular misconceptions of the New Deal and how gains are really won by the working class. The capitalist media is trying to create a political tidal wave about the upcoming primaries and elections. Their message to Occupy Wall Street and the working class movement is that however righteous the movement was, it is now over, and the grown-up thing to do now is to vote. According to the ruling class stooges in the media, this is how change really happens. That the important thing to do is to be peaceful and legal and vote. This is totally false and always has been. So many things used to be illegal. 150 years ago, it was illegal for African American slaves to escape, and illegal for anyone to help them. It used to be illegal for non-property owners to vote, or for women to vote, or for workers to form a union, or to strike. It is still illegal in most places for lesbian, gay, and trans people to marry, and the struggle goes on. Never have any concessions been won by the vote only. The only thing that made what was formerly illegal legal was the class struggle, in all its many forms and on many levels. The history books call the 1920s the Roaring Twenties, the so-called golden age in U.S. history, but the gold only roared to the top. The 1% celebrates this age of virulent racism, anti-unionism, and witch hunts of immigrants. Productivity surged in the 1920s, but one-tenth of 1% of the population had a total income more than the bottom 42%. Only a small percentage of the working class even worked a 5-hour week. The average work week was 55 hours in iron and steel, 54 in textiles, and 60 hours a week for the average laborer. Yet, as today, about half the population was poor. It was worse for immigrants, mostly from East Europe at the time, and even worse for African American families. In this period, the wages of African Americans was about 1/2 that of the already low wages of white workers. Jim Crow discrimination was the law of the land in the South, and open discrimination was rampant in the North. The Ku Klux Klan had over 4 million members. Lynching and other terrorist acts in the South were not uncommon and generally ignored by every level of government. The KKK also violently opposed immigration and union organizing, serving as company spies, thugs, and assassins of union organizers. In this period, strike after strike was lost. However, nationally, the working class was no longer completely segregated. 500,000 African Americans had moved north during and after World War I. By 1930, more than 25% of African American men were employed in industrial jobs, compared with only 7% in 1890. By the mid-1930s, African American workers made up 20% of laborers, 6% of the workers in steel industry, and 1/5 of the workforce in Chicago slaughterhouses were African American. This was the situation for the working class when the stock market crashed in 1929, and things got even worse. $25 billion of stock value vanished overnight. Over 5,000 banks failed. Official unemployment soared from 3% to 25%. In response to the crisis, the owners cut wages by 45% on average. Many unemployed men left their families, so the meager relief rations would stretch further. Poor families from the Midwest migrated to California to work in the fields. while thousands of Mexican workers were deported en masse. The response of the Hoover administration was to appoint committees and commissions to study the problem. They concluded it was the employers who needed help. So the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was begun to finance building projects such as the Hoover Dam. But these projects were only drops in the bucket. The American Federation of Labor at the time did not oppose wage cuts, opposed unemployment insurance, practiced Jim Crow segregation, and joined Hoover in telling workers that prosperity is just around the corner. But working class resistance was only beginning. With hunger marches, demonstrations against unemployment and against evictions. The first national demonstrations against unemployment were called by the Trade Union Unity League in 1932. 100,000 packed Union Square in New York. Demonstrations also took place in Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, San Francisco, and other cities. Everywhere the marches were red-baited, and hundreds were arrested and beaten. But the movement strengthened. The National Unemployed Council was founded in Chicago in 1930. Through patient, conscious organizing, it built branches in 46 states and in cities and towns everywhere. They organized hunger marches and mass mobilizations in the streets and demanded jobs through public works, unemployment insurance, as well as food and shelter, and the elimination of racist discrimination. One of the most important organizing efforts of the Unemployed Council was the struggles against evictions. When a family faced eviction, the local council would mobilize its forces and the surrounding neighborhood to keep the family in the house. And these tactics prevented the eviction of thousands. They also conducted penny auctions, where one person would bid 1 penny for the property, and the community assuring that no one broke solidarity and bid more. And the house would be given back to the original owners. That's something. Now, the Communist Party of the 1930s played a leading role in initiating these struggles, and their record of fighting racism and promoting class solidarity was a crucial prelude to the struggles to come. Now, the role of the left in winning social justice, or a measure of social justice, in this country is practically ignored. There were many other socialist organizations that played pivotal roles in the struggle. Now, the CP initiated an aggressive defense of the case of the Scottsboro brothers. 9 African-American men convicted by a Jim Crow jury and a totally rigged injustice system in Alabama and sentenced to death in 1931. The CP vigorously opposed racism in its ranks and in every organizing effort and in unions, defense committees, and cultural events. The CP made the case of the Scottsboro brothers a national and international cause. The Soviet Union, which had the prestige of rapid industrialization through its 5-year plans at a time when the West was in economic decline, gave the case support, as well as its allied parties. For example, this was a surprise. There was a large demonstration in support of the Scottsboro brothers in Berlin, Germany, by the Communist Party of Germany, 2 years before the Nazi takeover. That's something. Yeah. When the election of 1932 came, the Democrat Franklin Roosevelt was elected in a landslide. So great was the hatred for Herbert Hoover that Roosevelt was seen as a savior to many, despite his relatively conservative budget balancing platform. The New Deal promise to U.S. workers was very high on theater, but very low on performance. The early programs of the New Deal were in response to the capitalist economic crisis. Laws intended to reassure Wall Street that things were under control. Laws regulating banking, laws to balance the budget, and regulatory agencies such as the Securities Exchange Commission to harness speculation. These laws were intended to regulate profit-making and prevent another depression. Of course, today, the super rich want everything, and they don't want any regulation either. There was limited unemployment relief, such as the Civilian Conservation Corps, that employed youth at a very low wage. Most of that wage was sent directly to the families of the young workers. Such was the desperation of the times. But the early years of the Roosevelt administration saw a great upheaval of the working class. The election of Roosevelt brought hope, but the working class could not eat hope, and they could not afford to wait. Hunger, starvation, and desperation demanded action. In 1932, it was estimated that about 75% of the population was living at or below the poverty line. It was the great working class upheaval that came soon after the elections that sent alarm bells off in the boardrooms of Wall Street and brought concessions from the Roosevelt administration. It was not Roosevelt's election that brought the concessions, but the class struggle of the workers that put the fear of God into the 1%. Or more accurately, the fear of godlessness. Yeah. The bonus march of 1932 organized over 25,000 veterans to D.C., coming on foot from everywhere to demand early payment of a promised bonus to veterans. This multinational march was called by Communist Party and other socialists and occupied part of Pennsylvania Avenue for months. It was violently suppressed by the U.S. Army led by General Douglas MacArthur, turning whips and horses on the veterans, their wives, and children. But the anger only grew, and things were about to change. The long, hard work by the CP and other left and progressive organizations, the patient agitation, the anti-racist work, all the preparation and earlier struggles gave way to a new, angry, determined working class movement that could not be stopped by anti-communist propaganda, arrests, beatings, or shootings. Despite the ravaging unemployment, a great strike wave engulfed the country. In 1933, nearly 1 million workers went on strike. This is despite 25% unemployment. In 1932, nearly 2 million. The first sit-down in the U.S. was at the Hormel Packing Company in Minnesota in 1933. After the workers occupied the plant for only 3 days, the company agreed to recognize the union and bargain for better wages. The movement grew. In 1936, there were 48 different sit-down strikes. In 1937, there were 477, according to official figures. For example, For example, in Detroit alone, workers occupied every Chrysler factory, 25 auto parts plants, 4 downtown hotels, 9 lumber yards, 10 meatpacking plants, 12 laundries, and 2 department stores. Can you imagine? Wow. The union drive was on. Of course, the greatest and most famous sit-down occurred at the General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan. It was led by communists and socialists with the support of the newly formed Committee for Industrial Organization, the CIO. GM refused to bargain with the union, so the workers were forced to sit in the factory to support the union drive and to prevent GM from moving parts and machinery out of the factory. The occupiers were supported by thousands of unionists, their wives and families, and by women who picketed outside to protect the strikers from attacks from fascist gangs and who smuggled food and other supplies to the strikers. Every day was a battle or confrontation with the police, with fascist thugs and finally the National Guard. But the strikers sent a message to the governor. Unarmed as we are, the introduction of the militia, sheriffs, or police with murderous weapons will meet a bloodbath of unarmed workers. We have decided to stay in the plant. Wow. After 44 days of occupation, fearful of an even greater struggle developing, GM gave in to recognize the United Auto Workers. Spontaneous strikes broke out in all over auto. In 1 year, the UAW membership grew from 35,000 to 375,000 in 1 year. Yeah, that's something. This was just the tip of the iceberg. There was also a tremendous general strike in San Francisco, which began against Shape-Up on the docks, but spread throughout the city after police fired into the crowd, killing at least 2 strikers. The Teamsters strike in Minneapolis was led by socialist workers who organized the workers in a long and successful struggle for union recognition. The local that initiated the strike was led by socialists until 18 were arrested in 1941 under the Smith Act for advocating the overthrow of the government. This was when the so-called workers' friend Roosevelt was still president, but by this time he was preparing the country for war. The Committee of Industrial Organization was founded because the old, racist, craft unionist, collaborationist AFL refused to organize industrial workers. Since many industrial workers were relatively easy to replace on the assembly line, the AFL felt they could not be organized. The fact of the labor upsurge is testament to the solidarity that was felt in the working class. The spirit of solidarity was sweeping the country, and there was very little scabbing. Faced with what amounted to a widespread working class rebellion, the Roosevelt administration responded with a host of concessions. The Wagner Act encouraged unionization, provided time and a half for overtime, and many other safeguards. The Social Security Act of 1935 established pensions for seniors and set up an unemployment insurance program. The Works Progress Administration was established, giving jobs to millions of workers in public works projects, public buildings and roads, as well as art, drama, and media projects. Virtually every community benefited from both the new jobs as well as the building of parks, bridges, and schools. The WPA employed women as well as men, African American and white workers, and generally, I believe, paid the prevailing wage. It fed children and distributed food, clothing, and housing. Almost every community in the United States had a park, bridge, or school constructed by the WPA. But these were the fruits of the class struggle, not the election of Roosevelt. The ruling class hated Roosevelt nonetheless, but they tolerated him like we might tolerate a root canal from a dentist. Painful, but necessary. Roosevelt told the workers that the only thing they had to fear was fear itself. But his message to the 1% was that the only thing they had to fear was if the working class made a revolution and did away with them altogether. That moved them. In fact, when the heat of the struggle subsided even a bit, Roosevelt slashed relief and works programs for the unemployed in 1938 and again in 1939, thank you, even though unemployment was again rising. The only war preparations ended the Great Depression, just as war preparations had restored a false prosperity in Europe, especially in Nazi Germany. Although the New Deal Roosevelt seems like a far cry from the Nazi leader Adolf Hitler, both led their countries into an imperialist war, a war of imperialist rivalries. For the historians who explain that World War II was a war between US democracy and totalitarianism, we must say to them, tell that to the Japanese Americans who were interred in camps during the war in a racist hysteria. Tell that to the Koreans who suffered 2 million casualties, civilian casualties during the war, the Korean War. Tell that to the Vietnamese who suffered millions more killed. And both countries suffered grievously from Pentagon biological warfare. Tell that to the Iranians who suffered the US-imposed Shah. Tell that to the Palestinians. Tell that to the Chileans who suffered under the US-inspired fascist coup in 1973. And tell that to the Soviets who bore the brunt of the Nazi war machine. The US came into the war late and carefully measured their war effort until the defeat of Hitler was virtually certain. Tell that to the Iraqis, to the Afghans, and to the Egyptians who suffered 30 years of US-supported dictatorship and are still struggling. Tell that to the workers that oppressed here in the US who fought and died in the war but came home to the witch hunt and continued racist oppression. This list could go on forever. A thorough review of the struggles of the 1930s could take many discussions. But the lesson for the working class is that only the class struggle can win concessions, and only the socialist revolution that expropriates the ruling class can guarantee them. We have seen firsthand over the years how the gains of the New Deal have been whittled away, some immediately and some gradually. But the ruling elite always sees concessions as temporary, to be taken back as soon as practicable. The heroes of Occupy Wall Street have begun to wake up the rest of the working class and progressive movement. It was very clear that the multinational working class started to find its reflection in Zuccotti Park and other occupations around the country. The working class is just starting to find its voice that is so needed and has been missing for a long time. This is what scared the ruling class and gave them a serious case of the jitters. But nothing has been solved. The ruling class will not long be able to congratulate itself for the suppression of Occupy Wall Street, because the struggle continues and develops. But they will try very hard to direct progressive energy towards the upcoming elections, a safe, secure, and generally ineffectual forum for struggle. The ruling class idea of a fair election is pretty much what just happened in Iowa. in the Iowa caucuses, where the candidates, basically teabag stooges, were shadowboxing with each other, despite all the excitement of the election. And all the money spent and all the free and paid media coverage, only 5.2% of the eligible voters in Iowa even bothered to vote. Only 19.5% of registered Republicans in Iowa bothered to vote, which is even a smaller percentage than voted for George Bush in 2008 when he ran unopposed. As a tiny minority, the 1% like it when a tiny minority decides elections. It's their comfort zone. But when the spirit of struggle, such as that shown by Occupy Wall Street, is wedded to the creative energies of the entire working class, what once seemed impossible will become inevitable. Long live the spirit of the multinational working class. Thank you. Just a little note. I think it's very important that we pay as much attention as we can to our own history, not because we're historians, but because we're not. The ruling class has stolen our history, and every movement, sooner or later, looks to the past for its history. I think that was true of movements in the 60s. They looked for African American history, women's history, lesbian gay history. Sooner or later, a movement wants to know how it got here and who it is. And I think, as Caleb mentioned a while back, how important a lot of people that he had contact with, and we all had contact with, wanted to know what the history was. And not only the lessons of history, but just who we are and how we got here, because the ruling class has stolen our history for a reason, because they don't want us to know that. And it's a very rich history of the multinational working class, men and women, lesbian, gay, straight, able-bodied, disabled, black, Latin, white, Asian. It's the working class, and that's the history that has been stolen from all of us, and we need to revive.